2 1 2 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 2 2 2 1 2 test 1 2 1 2 test 1 2 1 2 test 1 2 2 1 2 2 2 2 2
but it would be very nice if we can all settle down. We are in a country that's not used to using air conditioning, so we have our windows open and the air conditioning on, so that's trying to go for the best of both worlds. But we hope we can keep it relatively cool in here with an interesting program for everybody. So we're looking to start in probably 1 or 2 minutes' time. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, I am going to start exactly on 2 o'clock because we are streaming this to Newcastle. So while we're waiting in the last few moments, I'm just going to say that as far as I know, we're not expecting any fire alarms this afternoon. So if one is to go off, then you do need to evacuate. Okay. Can I just check with you at the back that we're ready to stream this to Newcastle? Thank you. Okay, then we will start. So, good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this wonderful venue of BMA House in London to join Newcastle's University celebration to mark 21 years of hosting a WHO collaborating centre for nutrition and oral health. I'd also like to welcome our audience back in Newcastle University because we're live streaming this event to them today, so hello Newcastle. The WHO Collaborating Centre in Nutrition and Oral Health was established back in 1996 by its founder, Professor Andrew Ruggan, Emeritus Professor of Newcastle University, and I have to say I'm delighted to know that he's somewhere in the audience today, so welcome Andrew, it's great to see you here. The WHO Collaborating Centre's mission for the last 21 years has been to provide the WHO with advice on nutrition and oral health and to collaborate in both research and scholarship to improve both oral and general health worldwide. For our celebrating symposium, we put together a programme around achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the role of nutrition and oral health in this. And we did this in collaboration with the Global Oral Health Inequalities Research Network of the International Association of Dental Research. And I must in particular thank Professor Peter Mossy for his help and advice in putting this programme together. Thank you, Peter. And when selecting the speakers to invite, we decided to be ambitious. And we invited Dr. Benoit Verheyen from the WHO Geneva, who leads the Oral Health Programme, Professor Srinath Reddy from the Public Health Foundation in India, and also Professor Jim Mann, who's a member of WHO's Nutrition Guidance Advisory Group and also comes from a WHO collaborating centre in nutrition at the University of Otago in New Zealand. And I have to say that I was absolutely overjoyed when they all said yes and accepted the invitation to come and contribute towards our special day. Over the years, the WHO Collaborating Centre at Newcastle has hosted several guests, or numerous guests from all over the world, and actually many of you are here today, and it is so wonderful to see you. And in fact, today we have members from, or members and delegates from all over the world. So from Africa, from Asia, from South America, North America, Europe and the Middle East and Australasia. So it truly is an international event. Now in a moment I'm going to pass you over to the chairs of today's session, and that is Professor Mark Thomason, who's Dean and Head of School of Newcastle School of Dental Sciences, and Professor Peter Mossy from the University of Dundee, who's also from the Gohera Network and also directs the WHO Collaborating Centre at Dundee. But before I do, I just want to thank a few people. I'd like to thank Jill Smith, Gwen Foster, Grace Gardner, also Janice Ellis and Mark Thomason and the Newcastle team, because they've helped with all the practicalities of putting today's session together, and it wouldn't have been possible without you. And also, I'd like to wish each and every one of you an enjoyable and intellectually stimulating afternoon. I hope that you take the opportunity to network with friends and colleagues at the reception that follows on from this symposium. And finally, I hope that you all go away today having learned something new. Thank you.
So, good afternoon, and as was said earlier, Paula has introduced me as Peter Mossy. I am Director of a WHO Collaborating Centre, and I welcome you all to a hot and humid London. On the positive side, it's making those from those kind of climes feel at home. On the negative side, we don't have a system that copes very well with hot weather. It's kind of, we deal with mediocrity here, not too cold, not too hot. But in just one small comment to add to what Paula has said, as a fellow director of a WHO Collaborating Centre, I'm aware of the current challenges, and the meeting is very aptly entitled Achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals Through Nutrition and Oral Health. And if there's no better place to be in the world today than to see a curtain raiser to that agenda. So we have a list of speakers who are also here for the IADR, and the agenda on the IADR will be addressing non-communicable diseases via the US NDGs as one of its major dominant items. So, without further ado, I'm going to say just a couple of words about our first speaker. Benoit is the current head of oral health at the WHO in Geneva, and his current program office is to do with the global agenda for oral health. Before joining the WHO, we will need to be aware of what he's done as a regional advisor for oral health in the WHO African region, and the focal point of his term of office in the African region has been to produce a document which has laid the strategy for addressing oral disease as part of non-communicable diseases. And one other remarkable thing that he has done recently is bring to our attention a new focal point through modern technology, through mobile health, and that's one of his big accolades, is the Be Healthy, Be Mobile project. But without further ado, I'm going to ask if Benoit can address us, and the title is Oral Health, in the role of oral health in achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Benoit.
Thank you, Peter. Good afternoon. Just need to open. That's it, okay. So just a few words to start. First, I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for your kind invitation, Professor Paula, and thank you to Newcastle University for organizing this nice event. So the purpose of my presentation will be mainly to share with you how WHO now is adapting its own strategic priorities and operating models to fit better, to contribute better to the SDG agenda. And to some extent explore also with you what would be the contribution of the oral health community toward this global agenda. So just to avoid some boring slide, we just try to show you a short video to introduce, as I am a first speaker. It's nice because I can try to present the goals. Okay, that's it. So now you have an overview of the 17 goals. So these goals are quite a collection of global goals set by United Nations in 2015. So it's kind of universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy health, peace, and prosperity. So now, just to enter a bit into the details, there is a specific goals related to health. It's the number 3. And in WHO, we try to organize a bit this SDG because, of course, it's our own focus. So we have a part of this SDG 3 who are kind of unfinished agenda of the Millennium Development Goals. It's on the left of the slide. It's mainly linked with communicable disease and maternal mortality and child death, of course, including communicable disease, HIV, tuberculosis, and other height-level burden communicable disease. In blue in the center, you have the new target and the new indicators related to NCDs, non-communicable disease. So you have some related to reduction of mortality, some related to reinforced prevention and treatment of substance abuse and some other risk factors. And on the right of the slide, you have what we call the means of implementation targets. So we have, for example, using the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and we have other specific means of implementation of some targets. And as kind of umbrella target, it's on the blue dark above, it's of course achieving universal health coverage. Because this goal, of course, is one of the top priority now of WHO to ensure that financial risk protection, access to quality essential healthcare services, medicine and vaccines are for all. So this is quite a broader view of this SDG 3 related to health area, health sector. So I think we have to be clear and say that definitely SDG list key actions toward determinants of health and highlight health inequality as a key priority for the organization and for the other health partners and countries. And we think that, of course, it's a unique opportunity for addressing health and its determinants in an integrated and transformative way. So to achieve this, contribute to this SDG area in the health sector, WHO, with the new DG, who was elected more or less 1 year ago now, is Dr. Tedros, decided to really reorganize the organization. So now we have these 3 bubbles, and it's the 3 new strategic priority of the organization. So you have on the top this healthier population, and certainly, because it's not clear at this time, but NCD department, including oral health, will be part of this first bubble. You have another bubble, of course, very important, and I think also the idea, of course, it's each technical area will contribute to these 3 bubbles. We have to avoid some silo approach and contribution. So it's also a way to try to work better across the organization, HQ, regional level, and country office level. And the last bubble, of course, it's related to health emergencies. So we have this global program of work that will drive our priority for the organization between 2019 and 2023, so for 5 years. And definitely this has been built to contribute better to SDG achievement. So now if we are talking about oral health program perspective, it's important also that we are able to contribute to this agenda, even if it looks a big agenda and a huge problem linked with social determinants, poverty, and other aspects. We think that the oral health community and WHO oral health program could contribute. So we are proposing at WHO level and for the program 6 lines of action to ensure that, again, we can contribute quite realistically but also efficiently to this SDG agenda, and particularly the SDG 3 agenda. So these are the main priority for the next 3 years of the oral health program. A lot of you have already seen this slide, but it is important, and we will see after that how each component priority could fit with the 6 lines of action. So I will take several examples to see that we can contribute. First, one of the first line of action is intersectoral action by multiple stakeholders. So we started now last year to think about a new global health report because we need a new and robust advocacy document to relaunch the oral health commitment at global level. And so we think that this work, this kind of document could really pave the way for the development of a global oral health action within this new global health context. So this is very important, and this work could be conducted only through multi-sectoral involvement, including, of course, WHO, but also quality centers and other partners like IDR and FDI, to see the main global oral health partners. Another agenda also of global oral health program is to work for the implementation of the Minamata Convention. This Minamata Convention is an international treaty endorsed 2 years ago now, and so now we are in the phase of implementation. And one part of this international treaty is asking member states, countries, to phase down the use of dental amalgam to reduce the impact of dental amalgam, mainly toward the environment. So we are working with some other UN agency, UNEP, United Nations Environmental Program, to implement this, this convention and to support some countries in accelerating the phase down of dental amalgam. So this is a quite important activity in our agenda. And another aspect is linked with health system strengthening for universal health coverage. We are working on the identification of best buys, oral health, that has been the case already with some other NCDs. And we think that identification of such cost-effective intervention could be very useful for countries to move forward the agenda and to implement the best intervention, you know, based on evidence and economical assessment. We have also to work, and we started, Peter mentioned the work we have already done in African region to try to define at district level, at school level, but also at community level, sorry, which kind of package of essential intervention in terms of prevention, but also in terms of management, would be the best approach to tackle the oral health issue. And this, of course, could be done in following the universal health coverage. So the idea, of course, it's at the end to have a set of intervention, essential information intervention, part of this UHC initiative. In terms of health equity and human rights, I think the natural example we can mention, of course, it's the fights against NOMA. I don't know if all of you are aware about this oral disease starting in the mouth, mainly in the child between 2 and 6 years old, mainly in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and it's just called the face of poverty. So it's more than a disease, it's really a development issue. So with the support of some partners, we have been able to organize a regional program of NOMA control, and we are working now with 10 countries, from Senegal to Ethiopia, to try to prevent and to fight this disease. When we are talking about financing and sustainable financing, we try through the Minamata Convention implementation, but also some other initiative like M Oral Health Program, to try, of course, to mobilize resources from some global environmental facility. It's a kind of trust funds, including member states and partners involved in environmental issue, and with, of course, the support of oral health partners. So I think if we want, again, to move oral health agenda and to contribute to SDG development, we have to be innovative in terms of financing. It's the case through the using mobile technology, because a lot of private entities are quite interested in such area, and we hope that they can provide some funds and support at country level to implement some action. Scientific research and innovation. I will take also the example of the M Oral Health Program. so using mobile technology to improve oral health situation. We develop a concept, other 4 components. We want to develop oral health literacy, so improve knowledge and at the end have an impact in terms of behavioral changes. We also hope to develop some health training based again on this mobile and digital technology. We also started to think with some startup and research development entity to work on using mobile technology for early detection of normal disease, but also oral cancer. We know that the future of some early detection are definitely passing by using new and digital technology. Another aspect also, and of course it's clear that I have to mention the work did by Newcastle University for a long time now period in the area of sugars and nutrition. So as you know, Newcastle University contribute directly and to the development of some guidelines concerning sugar intakes. And now, thanks to the work did by Paula and her team, we are working on some systematic literature reviews on early childhood caries and also develop some guidance, technical guidance for implementation. Another aspect linked with these 6 lines of action that could again contribute to this global agenda, of course, it's all related to monitoring progress and evaluation of the program. So we have also some activities on this area, and we hope to work with some experts and to update some oral health indicators and maybe to develop and prop up some new ones that could be more friendly and related to decision makings. Last slide, just to mention that this SDG framework is a unique opportunity for addressing health and its many determinants, and it could be a powerful framework for reducing oral health inequality. WHO started to move its own agenda, and we hope, of course, that oral health community could also make some reflection about how to reorient in some way some strategic priority to contribute better to such development goals. And using the 6 lines of action I mentioned, we think that it could be critical to align between WHO and other oral health partners our own action to be more strategic and to ensure that the resources would be fitting the same objective and again toward the same objectives. Of course, concerning academia, and I know that we have today a lot of head of corrective centers, and I think there is a lot of research that are mainly neglected so far. I just want to talk about this economical assessment, cost-effectiveness analysis on oral health intervention. There are few researchers working on that, and I think it's, again, a very important area. Universal health coverage, which kind of intervention, which kind of cost-effective intervention we can put in this package for prevention and management of oral disease. And also linked with the Minamata Convention and the end of this, the use of dental amalgam, it would be great that more research can focus on alternative approaches, not only materials, but approaches and materials to dental amalgam. That's it. The last slide. It's not so nice cake, but it's definitely healthy one. Happy birthday to Newcastle WHO Collaborative Center. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benoit, for that expert presentation. Could you maybe stay on the podium because we're so well ahead of time? That was really very succinct, very clear, and showed your true leadership. But we need to take questions, if there are ones in the audience now, before the panel will convene at the end. So if anyone has a quick question. Yul.
Thank you, Benoit. I know you agree about integration with other aspects of the healthcare professions, but how do we make it work? I am fed up with dentists talking to dentists. How do we get the message out to primary healthcare workforce and the public in general?
Thanks for the question. Well, usually when someone asks this kind of question, I try to explain that, first of all, I try at my own level, you know, because this question is not only to share some information with dentists, but also within our own and daily environment. So it's a fight for me. I struggle every day to explain to WHO colleagues and sometimes some dentists how we can move this agenda without, you know, because it's true that if you are talking now about dentists, it's they feel that maybe too much integration is something we will miss something, or we will lost something, you know, in terms of so I don't know, depends of course which is the real target, but I think we if we are sure that it's the good way and it could contribute to mobilize more resources, if the people, I think, are ready to understand that in addition with what they are doing more or less quite well for years, if they in addition are able to understand that they can contribute to other agenda, fight against the other NCDs and things like this, I feel that it would be a good way, you know. And I'm thinking about now Aubrey Sheham, because he was also, of course, committed in all this aspect, and for him, for sure, each dentist should be an advocate for more integration and contribute to a bigger agenda than the dental one. So,
Which is ironic that we sit in BMA House. Is there any representative of the British Medical Association in the room, or any non-dentist in the room?
Yeah, delighted to say that indeed we have a very good agenda this afternoon that will deal with the non-communicable diseases agenda. So thank you very much, Neil. Any other questions at this point? And if not, I think we'll just call on Paula, please, and Mark. Oh, yes.
And so just a small presentation to say thank you for the event. Thank you very much, Benoit. So we'll just change over now, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Paula Moynihan. As you know, Paula is Professor of Nutrition and Oral Health and Director of the Centre of Oral Health Research at Newcastle University. She's a great colleague and a friend, and it's a great pleasure to be here to welcome her. As you've already heard, she is also the Director of the WHO Collaborating Centre, whose anniversary we're celebrating today. Her research interests include the interrelationship between nutrition and oral health through the life course and dietary intervention in older adults. Being expert advisor on carbohydrates and dental health to the WHO Nutrition Guidelines Advisory Group, she led the WHO commissioning a systematic review of evidence relating to the amount of sugars in dental caries that has informed the WHO guidelines on dietary sugars. She's also a member of the European Food Safety Authority Working Group on added sugars. Paula is the Vice President of the IADR and will take up the position of President in 2019. Not satisfied with that alone, she's currently the President of the Geriatric Oral Research Group and past President of the Nutrition Research Group of the IADR. In 2004, Paula was awarded the UK Nutrition Society's Silver Medal for Excellence of Research of a Young Scientist. In 2010, she then went on to be awarded the IADR Distinguished Scientist Award for Geriatric Oral Research. Paula has over 100 publications in peer-reviewed journals, several book chapters, and is on the editorial board of a number of scientific journals, including the Journal of Dental Research. And clearly, she presents her work on a national and international forum. Her current research includes an evidence of Public Health England's Sugar Smart Health marketing campaign, which aims to reduce the sugar intake in children. It's an enormous pleasure to invite Paula to the podium, and I'm sure we'll welcome her in the usual way. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Mark. The aim of my presentation is to give you an overview into the interrelationship between nutrition and oral health, and how oral health, through its link with nutrition, can help in achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So, we know that the UN Sustainable Development Goals aim to reduce premature death from non-communicable diseases by a third by 2030, and also to end all forms of malnutrition. And nutrition is key to this. Nutrition impacts on both oral and systemic non-communicable diseases, and oral health, through its link with nutrition, can also impact on general health. So over the next 25 minutes, I'm going to look at both sides of this relationship. I'm going to look at the impact of diet and nutrition on oral health, considering sugars and caries, other carbohydrates and oral health, and the impact of undernutrition on oral health. But then I'm going to look at the other side of the coin and look at the impact of oral health on nutrition and consider the evidence that we have for dental caries and for tooth loss contributing to malnutrition. And we know that reducing sugars is key to reducing many non-communicable diseases, in particular dental caries. And in 2015, the WHO published its guideline on sugars intake for adults and children and made a strong recommendation that the intake of free sugars should be no more than 10% of energy intake, and actually preferably it should be no more than 5% in order to protect oral health throughout the life course. So what are free sugars? Well, sugars include all mono and disaccharides, and added sugars include those mono and disaccharides added to food, whether it be by manufacturer, by cook, or consumer. And this classification also sometimes includes those sugars that you find in honey and syrups and things like agave nectar. Now, we know from looking at the evidence that those sugars that you find located inside the cellular structure of whole fruits and vegetables and grains, don't have an important role to play in the development of non-communicable diseases. And so it's the sugars other than these that have been classified as free sugars. So they include all mono and disaccharides that are added to food by manufacturer, by cook, by consumer, plus those sugars in honey and syrups, and also those in fruit juices and fruit juice concentrates. So it's the intake of these sugars that we need to restrict for both oral health and health purposes. Now, the evidence that underpinned the WHO guideline came from two comprehensive systematic reviews, one on sugars and overweight and obesity, and the other on amount of sugars and dental caries. And the systematic review on amount of sugars and dental caries was conducted by Dr. Sarah Kelly and myself from Newcastle University, and it was published in the Journal of Dental Research. And this systematic review identified 55 studies that looked at amount of sugar and dental caries, and 47 of those found at least one positive association between intake of sugar and dental caries. 6 reported both positive and null findings, 7 didn't find an association, and 2 reported positive associations. But overall, 2 reported negative associations, but overall the positive associations predominated, and they covered low, middle and high income countries and all decades of publication from the 1950s to the current day. Now, the systematic review took on what we call the best available evidence approach, and this is when one uses the best available evidence in terms of study design, but considers evidence of a lower level when making the overall assessment. Now, when it came to dental caries and sugars intake, there were no randomised control trials, and so the best available evidence came from the cohort studies. And there were 5 cohort studies that had data that enabled us to compare the levels of dental caries when the intake of free sugars was above 10% of energy intake to when it was below. And all of these studies found lower levels of dental caries when the intake of free sugars was equivalent to below 10% of energy. And they're shown on this slide, and the ones in black are for the permanent dentition, and the ones in blue are the primary dentition. So Rortanen found that a low sugar intake in those that had an intake of less than 10% of energy as sugars from birth had DMFT of 0.5 compared with 1.4. Sticks and Blix found in a low dental caries group that the sugar intake was equivalent to below 10% of energy, and in the high caries group it was above 10%. Gunn found the highest added sugar intake group had developed more caries than the lower added sugar intake group, who were having sugar intake below 10% of energy intake. And Rodriguez in Brazil found that children were almost 3 times more likely to have high levels of dental caries when their sugars intake exceeded 10% of energy intake. And Karjalainen found that in those that remained cavities-free, the sugar intake was below 10%, and it wasn't in those that developed caries. But even though we see lower levels of caries in these children consuming less than 10%, we still see some caries. And this is important because even low levels of dental caries in childhood are of significance to later life, because we know that dental caries is a progressive and cumulative disease. There are good data from the Dunedin longitudinal study that show that children with a DMFS of below 3 go on to develop a much higher DMFS by age 32. And we see year-on-year annual increases in caries increments, even in fluoridated areas of the USA in older adults. So we went on, because of this, to say, well, should sugars intake be lower? What is the effect on dental caries of restricting sugars to below 5% of energy intake? But there are very few epidemiological data of populations consuming such low levels of sugars. And the best available evidence actually came from meticulously conducted oral health surveys of Japanese school children before, during and after World War II. And this was a time in which the intake of free sugars fell from a pre-war level of around 15 kilograms per person per year to below 0.2 kilograms. So these these studies had data that enabled us to compare the levels of dental caries when the intake of sugar was below 5% of energy with when it was between 5 and 10. And all the studies showed lower caries at below 5%, and all of them showed strong log linear relationships between sugars intake and dental caries. But the system for classifying the quality of evidence that was used, the grade system, classified these data as being very low quality, and that's because ecological data as such has a much higher risk of bias. But nonetheless, we need to interpret this alongside the fact that we still do see dental caries at sugars intake below 10% of energy, and sugars will impact on oral health throughout the life course. So what about other carbohydrates? What about starches and oral health? Well, when you look at global nutrition guidelines, a high percentage of energy from carbohydrate is recommended. Currently, 55 to 75% of calories from carbohydrate. Now, if you're going to achieve that while keeping your sugars intake low, you need a high intake of starch. And then back in 2003, the WHO in their report Diet, Nutrition and the Prevention of Chronic Diseases, based on a narrative review of the evidence, said there was convincing evidence that starchy staple foods were not related to dental caries. But we know that starch is a very diverse thing. It differs in botanical origin, it differs in level of processing and complexity, and it's important to know the effects of all different types of starch on oral health. And as part of updating guidance on carbohydrate, the WHO has recently commissioned systematic reviews of starch and health, and the systematic review of starch and oral health was conducted by a team at Newcastle University. And the questions posed by the WHO Nutrition Guidance Advisory Group subgroup on diet and health are shown here. So the systematic review asked, what is the effect of either an increase or a decrease in the intake of total starch on oral health? What's the effect of an increase or decrease in the intake of slowly digestible starches on oral health? And what's the effect of an increase or decrease in rapidly digestible starches on oral health? And for those starch classifications, we looked at the classification by Englis, but we also, to distinguish between rapidly and slowly digestible starches, we looked at higher versus lower resistant starch intake, higher versus lower legumes, whole grain starches compared with non-whole grain starches, starch-influenced diet versus a normal diet, and also looked for evidence relating to starch with different glycemic indexes. So it's quite a broad classification. And our systematic review, which was conducted according to PRISMA, identified 22 papers on total starch and oral health, and most of those related to dental caries. And then for the rapidly versus slowly digestible starches, we identified 28 studies, and most of those were on dental caries and oral cancer, with very little data out there actually on periodontal disease. So first, looking at the data that we found on total starch and dental caries, there were 21 studies, and the best available evidence came from 4 cohort studies. We were unable to pool those data because there was a lot of heterogeneity between studies, but what we did was a narrative synthesis, and that showed that there was evidence for no association between the intake of total dietary starch and risk of dental caries. And then we had data from 2 cross-sectional studies and 1 ecological study suggesting that starch intake did increase risk of dental caries when it was combined with sugars. So what about looking at the data we had for comparing rapidly digestible with slowly digestible starches? Well, here we had data from 4 epidemiological studies and 10 laboratory-based experiments, and data from 2 cohort studies showed that there was a positive association between the consumption of rapidly digestible starches and risk of dental caries, and this was classified as being of low-quality evidence using the grade methodology. But the data from lower-level evidence supported these findings. Moving on to look at periodontal disease, we didn't identify any studies that looked at total starch and periodontal disease, but we did identify data looking at the impact of slowly digestible starches in the form of whole grains. And 2 studies were identified. One cohort study found that a higher intake of whole grains, or slowly digestible starch in the form of whole grains, was associated with reduced risk. And then one cross-sectional study showed that a lower intake of slowly digestible starches as whole grains was associated with increased risk. And so there are limited, very low quality data that suggests that slowly digestible starches in the form of whole grains may be protective, but we do of course need more research. Regarding oral cancer, there was only one study that looked at total starch in oral cancer, and it found no significant effect. But with regards to slowly digestible starch, we were able to pool data from 2 cohort studies that looked at the impact of slowly digestible starches in the form of whole grains of oral cancer risk. And this did actually show a significant effect, and the hazards ratio indicated a reduction in risk of about 38%. But we need to really interpret this with caution, because these were studies that had different types of oral cancer. They were for female participants only, and they were from one geographical region of the world. So overall, with results with regard to starch and oral health, for periodontal disease we have very little evidence, a small amount of data suggesting a protection of whole grains. For oral cancer, again, we found data on whole grains suggesting that there may be a benefit. Most data we had for dental caries showing no effect of total starch, but there's low quality data to suggest that rapidly digestible starches will increase risk, and especially if in association with sugars. So I now want to move on and briefly look at the impact of undernutrition on oral health. And we know from looking back at studies in the 1990s, Nwanwu did a very comprehensive review of the role of undernutrition and protein energy undernutrition on the risk of periodontal disease, and found that aggressive periodontitis and gingivitis are more prevalent in impoverished societies. But some of these early studies didn't actually control for all the confounding factors. We know that malnutrition is one cause of enamel hyperplasia, and we know that enamel hyperplasia makes the teeth more susceptible to dental caries, and we also know that undernutrition can cause salivary gland dysfunction and can reduce buffering capacity of saliva, which can again increase risk of dental caries. Also, undernutrition can delay the exfoliation of the primary teeth and the eruption of the permanent teeth. So we can say that poorly nourished populations may be at increased risk to poor oral health. But actually what I'm more interested in is the other side of this relationship, and whether or not dental caries in particular is a risk factor for malnutrition or undernutrition in children. And this slide just shows an absolute snapshot of some data, because this is something I recently became interested in. We do have data, mostly from cross-sectional studies, that show an association between dental caries and undernutrition. But when you look for the systematic reviews, they've just been on body weight or BMI, and they've included both well-nourished and overnourished and undernourished. And no systematic review has specifically asked the question, does dental caries contribute to undernutrition? So currently we're doing a systematic review in our WHO Collaborating Centre that's specifically asking this question. And we've actually identified 100 papers to include in our analysis. That's after screening of full papers, and we're currently busy extracting the data from those papers to see whether or not we can find a more definitive answer to this question, because it's a really important one to answer, because if dental caries is a factor that contributes to undernutrition in children, then preventing dental caries becomes a key strategy in achieving that UN Sustainable Development Goal to prevent all forms of malnutrition by the year 2030. And of course, the impact of oral health on undernutrition isn't just restricted to children. What about older people? We know that we have a problem with malnutrition in older people worldwide. So is retention of the natural dentition important to maintaining good nutrition in later life? We know that in order to prevent the systemic non-communicable diseases that we need to eat plenty of fruits and vegetables, over 400 grams per day. Is that difficult if you have compromised oral health, if you have few teeth? Well, actually, many studies have looked at the association between tooth loss and diet, and many studies have shown that the edentulous consume a less healthy diet compared with the dentate. But most of these studies have just looked at association. They haven't looked at this prospectively. I mean, the most recent study was the global study on aging, which looked at this relationship and the factors associated with being edentulous in the 50-plus population from 5 middle-income countries. No, actually it was 6 middle-income countries, sorry, and found that being edentulous was independently associated with having or consuming less than the recommended amount of fruits and vegetables. This slide shows some of the studies in the last 10 years, and I know it's not exhaustive, but again, they don't prove causality. So, poor diet, and in particular a high free sugars intake, will cause tooth loss. And there's, as I said, data to show that tooth loss is associated with a poor diet. And we know that this poor diet can increase the risk of non-communicable diseases and obesity, cardiovascular diabetes and cancer. But we actually don't know whether or not that tooth loss has a causal link. But even if it doesn't, what it does tell us is that those that have tooth loss are a group that would benefit from nutrition intervention. What about the other end of the scale? What about looking at tooth loss and undernutrition? And we know that undernutrition is a problem in older people. And research back in the 1990s showed that frail older adults who were edentulous had lower nutrition scores, had lower BMI and lower albumins, and that undernutrition was associated with the number of remaining teeth. But some of these studies weren't always well controlled for confounders. More recently, Makawana in India has found that underweight is 8 times more prevalent in the edentulous compared with the dentate in the 60 to 80 age group, and that 34% of the edentulous population are at risk of being underweight. But interestingly, Furuta in Japan has done a very well-conducted study which showed that oral health status did impact on swallowing function, and that swallowing function was independently associated with nutritional status, but there was no direct effect of oral health status or chewing function on undernutrition. And so they were suggesting that oral health impacted on nutrition through its impact on swallowing function. The SAGE study on aging and health looked at nutritional status as a predictor of being edentulous. And this study did control for confounding. In the bivariate analysis, there was a significantly greater chance of being edentulous if you were underweight, but in the multivariate analysis, it didn't quite reach statistical significance, but the data do suggest some association between tooth loss and undernutrition. And the Newcastle 85-plus study, which is led by Dr. Carol Jagger at Newcastle University, is a prospective cohort study of health and aging. And it includes over 1,000 participants that were born in 1921 and were 85 at baseline. And they were followed up for, in the first instance, 5 years. And we had data on the oral health status of these participants at baseline. And we also had data on diet, body mass index, and hand grip strength from which we could assess nutritional status. But our multivariate analysis actually found no significant relationship between being edentulous and low intake of calories or energy, of low body mass index or of low hand grip strength. But we did find a significant relationship between being edentulous and having a low intake of protein. And this is something that we want to explore further. So it is very preliminary data. So I think that to sort of sum up, there is an association between tooth loss and undernutrition. We know that tooth loss and other indicators of poor oral health in older people cause swallowing difficulty, and we know that swallowing difficulty leads to a reduced food intake. However, we have to be very mindful that other factors impact on swallowing function a lot more in older age, for example, cognitive decline. We know that tooth loss and oral health problems also cause chewing difficulty, and that chewing difficulty leads to a lower food intake. But then again, many other factors in later life also are associated with reduced food intake. So what I'm trying to say is that oral health is part of the picture. It's not the full picture, but nonetheless it's an important factor, and it's one that often gets overlooked. Interestingly, I've talked a lot about associations, and they don't prove causality, and there's a lack of comprehensive prospective data looking at the impact of poor oral health on the development of undernutrition and of sarcopenia in later life. And Dr. Sheena Ramsey from Newcastle University, in collaboration with University College London and St George's London, is now about to start a study looking at this in a unique cohort of British adults. And the aim is to identify the oral markers that are associated with developing undernutrition and developing sarcopenia. And through using these data, the aim is to develop an instrument which by then you could use self-reported oral health measures as predictors of undernutrition. And we really need this research to affirm the relationship between oral health and undernutrition in older people. Well, I'm guessing that my time must be just about running up, so I'm going to draw my presentation to a close by concluding that the UN Sustainable Development Goals include ending all forms of malnutrition and reducing by 1/3 premature deaths from non-communicable diseases by 2030. And in my presentation today, I've aimed to illustrate how oral health, through its association with nutrition, may be important in achieving and addressing these goals. We know that reducing sugars intake will reduce dental caries and other non-communicable diseases. We know that promoting carbohydrates from whole grains may actually have a benefit to oral health. We have data to show associations between dental caries and malnutrition, and also that maintaining a functional dentition into later life may be important in preventing malnutrition in later life. And current research at Newcastle University Collaborating Centre is trying to get better evidence, more definitive evidence pertaining to these associations to strengthen the evidence base. The picture's by no means complete. We still have a lot of unanswered questions, but I hope that my talk today has given you an overall insight and also provided you with some food for thought about how oral health is important in maintaining adequate nutrition throughout the life course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula. I think that's a tremendous illustration of how bringing another specialty into the forum brings a new perspective. And that was a multifaceted walk through the oral health, nutrition arena. Thank you very much for that, Paula. You've also stuck very nicely to time, which enables us before coffee to have a couple of questions, if anyone has a question at this stage. There will still be the panel discussion at the end. Yes, Chris.
Thank you, Professor Moynihan. Is this on? Yes. The World Bank has a investment in ending childhood stunting in certain low and middle income countries. I'm wondering if any research has been done in the relationship or associations in oral health and stunting, which, as I understand, is sort of a chronic malnutrition.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear what you said.
Childhood stunting.
Oh, stunting, sorry. Well, that's actually one thing that we have included in our systematic review. So when I sort of say undernutrition, we're not just focusing on underweight, we're looking at all indicators of undernutrition, of which stunting is one. So I'm hoping that once we sift through those 100 papers, that I'll be able to answer that question, because I think it's a lot more important, because quite often people say, well, sugars is important in famine and things like that. Well, it's not for weight, for growth. And I think that the focus should be on stunting.
And just to add to that very briefly, you did mention the developmental delay that there is some evidence for, and I mean that's another component part in the eruption of teeth.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yeah.
Thank you very much. That was excellent. And I was also wondering, I suppose we could go through many conditions, but clefting and craniofacial anomalies, and you mentioned in Wanwoo's research, and NOMA. Those are all conditions associated with nutritional deficiencies.
Yes, I'm not aware of any systematic reviews on clefting and oral deformalities and undernutrition. I think it's certainly something that warrants looking into, definitely. I think we have very few data on NOMA, and that getting those data might be difficult. We know that actually undernutrition is the cause of NOMA, but then I suppose then you have a vicious cycle. But Peter, maybe you need to do a systematic review.
I will just add to what Lewis has said to reinforce the fact that there is a relationship between multivitamins and congenital anomalies, including cleft lip and palate. The evidence for folic acid alone is not strong, but the evidence for multivitamins is significant. And I think the nutritional aspects of the congenital anomaly story goes well beyond clefts. There's other congenital anomalies, such as limb reduction defects and congenital heart problems, which are also associated with nutritional deficiency.
That gives me a nice idea maybe to have another event.
Yes.
Thank you, Paula. How should we be dealing with the confounding factors? Because you quite rightly point out that associations are not cause and effect. And it was focused for me in your slides with the one paper for oral cancer that you quoted in relation to low glycemic index starches, because there is a mountain of literature that shows an association between micronutrients and risk of all cancers, including oral cancer. So how do we separate this in the kind of cross-sectional association studies that the literature is full of?
I think sometimes with diet it's possibly nigh on impossible, because we eat foods and not nutrients. So you can look at the effect of whole grains. Well, whole grains aren't just starch. They've got many other nutrients in them. So, so that's why I was trying to sort of say slowly digestible starches as whole grains and not make the claim for slowly digestible starch per se. In terms of confounding, I really do think that we need to focus on good prospective studies that right from the beginning plan to collect data on the important confounders and control for them. And unfortunately, in the body of data that we have, we quite often don't have that. So that's why we use a process for looking at the risk of bias, the quality of the data, and make the necessary sort of caveats to our conclusions at the end, because at the end of the day, when we are drawing, we're setting guidance on the best available evidence, and sometimes that's not always high quality.
We have a question from Andrew Ruggun.
You've highlighted the importance of undernutrition or malnutrition in the etiology of dental caries. I wonder if you can expand that a little. You said that the saliva glands were affected. Presumably that's either shortage of energy or protein. I don't know which. And the other nutrients which may be important in the etiology of dental caries. For example, in better developed countries, let's say, there still can be a nutrient shortages which might influence, and vitamin D is one that comes to mind. But
yes, I did rather go over that element of my presentation rather briefly, and it could have been a presentation in itself because, of course, protein deficiency is linked with salivary gland atrophy, vitamin A deficiency has been, and vitamin D, there is a systematic review that's being published on vitamin D intake and risk of dental caries. Again, it says that vitamin D deficiency, should I say, is a likely cause. But again, one of the problems with that systematic review was the quality of the data. But I think it probably is an important factor. And as we see in even high-income countries now with the use of sunscreen and things, children aren't getting as much vitamin D as they used to. So that's an issue. And we also have a number of nutrients, including protein, and also looking at calcium and phosphorus metabolism, the impact on the risk of enamel hyperplasia. Of course, at the other end of the scale, we've got the micronutrient fluoride, which protects against dental caries. So at least there's something positive to say on that as well.
Okay, perhaps we'll take one more question prior to coffee.
Thank you, Paula. I think it's a fascinating talk, very provocative, and I think we have many discussions to go based on your talk. But I would like to point out just to one small thing you said. You mentioned that, I mean, for all of us, it's clear that sugars is the main driver of caries. But you said that there were 2 studies showing an inverse relationship. So I was wondering, why would be that? I mean, those are the things that, makes you doubt about the evidence.
I think it's when you look at those studies will be data that look at sugars availability and patterns of dental caries over time. And then when you look at some of the data from industrialized countries, you see because they've got so much prevention and fluoride in, the sugars intake have gone really high. And so the sugars intake is going up and the dental caries is remaining stable. So I think that explains it, but it is that those 2 studies, and I should have perhaps stressed that, were just from studies that compare the average dental caries of 12-year-olds in the population compared with the average sugars availability in that population. And they were amongst the minority. If you're looking for the better quality data in the cohorts, there were no studies that showed that relationship.
Thank you so much, and thank everyone for the participation in that first session. We'll have coffee, and I wonder if we could come back at past, even though it says 15:35 on your program. It gives us a little bit more time for the panel discussion. And I would also like to say that it's very nice to see the former director of this WHO Collaborating Centre contributing to his own 21st birthday. So. Thanks. So you're all very impressively obedient. Thank you for coming back on time in the earlier time in the programme. So ladies and gentlemen, it gives me enormous pleasure to be able to welcome Professor Srinath Reddy, a true leader in his field. Professor Reddy is currently the president of the Public Health Foundation of India and formerly headed the Department of Cardiology at AIIMS, the All India Institute for Medical Sciences. He was appointed as the first Bernard Loan Visiting Professor of Cardiovascular Health at the Harvard School of Public Medicine and Public Health in 2009, and he's also an adjunct professor of the Rollins School of Public Health and Emory University. He has engaged since the PHFI have been his primary responsibility in capacity building in public health throughout India, through education, training, research, policy development, and health communication and advocacy. So, as you can see, his background is mainly in cardiology and epidemiology, and he was the head and leader of a number of global studies such as the InterSalt study of blood pressure and electrolytes, the InterHeart global study of risk factors of myocardial infarction, and numerous other engagements and awards that I will not have time to list. Just to say that he has more than 400 scientific publications in international journals. And one of the interesting aspects I noticed in his CV is that he was also on a global panel on agriculture and food systems for nutrition. So you can see that we have in our midst a true expert in his field and someone who's been a great leader and advocate of the non-communicable diseases agenda and an architect of the Sustainable Development Goals. He's also someone who has not only led the thrust to establish the NCD Alliance, but he's also a strong advocate to ensure an inclusive approach to the NCD Alliance, and that includes oral health. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Professor Reddy to speak to us, and I'm sure we're eagerly awaiting what he has to say. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Let me at the outset thank you for this excellent opportunity to be part of a very important event which celebrates 21 years of elegant and impactful science from the WHO Collaborating Center. And may I wish you many more years of leadership in this area. I have been asked to talk about the relationship of diabetes and oral health, particularly in the context of low and middle income countries, but naturally within the ambit of global health as spelled out by the Sustainable Development Goals. So when we look at the 21st century, certainly up to 2030, but even beyond, the trends are very clear. We are going to see a major rise in diabetes across the world. We're also going to see aging populations, something which was referred to in the previous presentation. And while we know that aging invariably is going to increase the number of persons with diabetes for a variety of reasons, we also know that aging poses a threat to oral health, and that the relationship between diabetes and oral health is bidirectional, which increases the threat of oral health as well as that of diabetes. I have omitted any reference to climate change, though it is very tempting to do so today. So when we come to diabetes at the global level, we find that of the 10 countries which top the league table for number of persons with diabetes, even in 2011, we had 7 countries from the low and middle income country grouping, with China and India leading the table. by 2030, not only are the absolute numbers going to rise sharply in each of these countries, but we will find that 8 of the top 10 are going to be, again, from the low and middle income countries. So clearly, the explosion of diabetes globally is going to significantly impact the populations of these countries. At the same time, when we look at aging in low and middle income countries, contrary to the belief that this is predominantly a problem of the high income countries, we find that even in low and middle income countries, aging is rapidly advancing to such an extent that by 2050, 80% of the older people will live in the low and middle income countries. Partly, it's a feature of the large population sizes of these countries, but also of the increasing longevity. Chile, China, and Iran will have a greater proportion of older people than United States of America. Difficult to imagine, but these are the projections from the United Nations. By 2050, 400 million persons will be over 80 years, what is called the very elderly group, and 100 million in China alone. So clearly, this is again going to pose the dual challenge of diabetes as well as oral health in the years to come. But even as we look at non-communicable diseases as a whole, we find that these epidemics are rapidly advancing globally and are particularly targeting the low and middle income country populations, while the deaths from non-communicable diseases as a share of total deaths between 2008 and 2030, according to a World Bank estimate, will certainly occur in every single region of the world. Those in the higher income group countries will be relatively small compared to the rapid rise in the proportional mortality rates that we will be witnessing in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, which currently are not very much in the popular mind associated with the NCD epidemics. But what is even more alarming is the fact that much of this excess mortality is going to be reflected in these countries in the younger age group. Even while aging is going to be a phenomenon, you're going to see a major impact in the productive person years of middle age. And particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, in the age group of 15 to 59, there's going to be a 44% increase, and in South Asia too, there's going to be a significant increase in this age group, whereas in some of the higher income countries, there will be actually a decline in this premature mortality. Now, when we look at diabetes, non-communicable diseases, other than diabetes, and oral diseases, and look at what are the common threads that connect them, clearly, there are common risk factors which seem to link many of the NCDs with risk factors which also impact upon oral health, even if all the risk factors are not common. So whether we are looking at smoking, alcohol, or we are looking at diet, stress, all of these seem to have a considerable cross-connectivity. And therefore, a common risk factor approach, or an integrated approach, appears to be very rational and called for in a public health response as well as a health system response, which looks at prevention at an early stage. Controlling a small number of risk factors may have a major impact on a large number of diseases at a lower cost, greater efficiency, and effectiveness than siloed disease-specific approaches. In an audience of predominantly dental health professionals, it would be rather imprudent on my part to venture into detailed discussion of the pathways which connect diabetes to oral health. Nevertheless, some reiteration of the science would be helpful to set the stage for deciding how the health system must indeed respond. So we know from the oral manifestations of diabetes that periodontal disease is particularly common because there are a number of inflammatory responses which are particularly manifest in the case of diabetes. Dry mouth due to reduced salivary flow, root caries because of gingival resorption and reduced salivary flow as well, oral candidiasis, pulp abscess and necrosis, particularly because of ischemic necrosis due to vascular damage from diabetes, because diabetes essentially impacts upon the blood vessels, and delayed wound healing as well because of vascular dysfunction and impaired fibroblast action. And when we look at periodontitis, it would result from an imbalance among the natural microbial biofilm on the teeth, the dental plaque, and the host inflammatory or immune response. And since diabetes is characterized by a destruction of the supporting structures and loss of the connective tissue attachment, we find that there is a definite relationship. But this relationship is bidirectional. Periodontal disease is often considered the sixth complication of diabetes, apart from the traditionally recognized ones like cardiovascular disease, nephropathy, foot ulcers, and so on. But periodontal disease is a possible risk factor also for poor metabolic control. Therefore, diabetes too suffers from periodontal disease. And when we look at some of the mechanistic pathways in greater detail, we find that there is stimulation of pro-inflammatory cytokines, neutrophils, monocytes, and macrophages, which Mechnikov had described centuries ago as the primum movens of all inflammation. All of these have a decreased number in persons with diabetes, affecting their immunocompetence. This prevents bacterial destruction in the periodontal pocket, thereby increasing periodontal destruction. And the pro-inflammatory cytokines produced in the inflamed periodontal tissue then gain access to the circulation via the periodontal microcirculation, exacerbating diabetes, because we know that any inflammatory response which is systemic can aggravate diabetes. Bacteria and bacterial products like periodontal infection with gram-negative microorganisms also adversely affect glycemic control. The advanced glycation end products, or AGEs, are principally also involved in the pathway. Since excess glucose comes in contact with the structural and other proteins, which, again, these bind to the cellular receptors on endothelial cells and monocytes, leading to a series of pro-inflammatory events by inducing the expression of the vascular cell adhesion molecule. This self-sustaining inflammation leads to the destruction of supporting tissues and periodontitis. Altered wound healing is again known because of inadequate fibroblast function in high glucose environments, and collagen is susceptible to rapid degradation by the matrix metalloprotease enzymes, the production of which is elevated in diabetes. And altered salivary flow also is very clear in reducing buffering capacity, dilution, and clearance. So to sum up, we are seeing a picture where poor glycemic control through several impact on caries, pulp necrosis, as well as peripheral abscess can induce inflammation, and that can lead to poor glycemic control. At the same time, periodontal disease itself can lead to diabetes or poor glycemic control with a number of complications of diabetes. When we look at the effects of periodontitis on diabetes, among people without diabetes, there is strong evidence for association between periodontitis and worse glycemic status. That is, those with periodontitis have a worse glycemic status than those without periodontitis. And among people with type 2 diabetes, periodontitis is associated with poorer glycemic control and higher insulin resistance. It seems to have an adverse effect on the level of insulin resistance as well as the nature of glycemic control achieved. And periodontitis is significantly associated with more diabetes complications, whether it is cardiovascular, retinopathy, nephropathy, or neuropathic foot ulcerations. And all of these have been studied well in literature. Persons with periodontitis have a greater risk of developing type 2 diabetes than those with better periodontal health. So again, periodontitis as a precursor or an unmasker of the predilection for diabetes is again fairly well documented. This, of course, has clinical implications. We are clearly seeing the adage that inflammation begets inflammation being very well demonstrated by this interrelationship between diabetes and periodontal disease. And intervention studies show that this can be interrupted. Intervention studies do show that a clinically significant and statistically meaningful reduction of glycosylated hemoglobin levels, HbA1c levels, with periodontal treatment in persons with type 2 diabetes, that means improvement of the diabetic control. Therefore, physicians treating diabetes should check for evidence of periodontal diseases and refer to dentists when needed. Similarly, dental healthcare providers should screen for diabetes in adults with periodontal disease. This often does not happen either in both cases. Also, we must be cognizant of the fact that persons with diabetes do not have a single disease. They often have coexistent other morbidities or the comorbidities. For example, they frequently have cardiovascular disease, which often requires the use of antiplatelet agents, example, aspirin or dipyridamole, or clopidogrel, which increase the risk of gum bleeding. Sometimes after stents, they're put on anticoagulants as well. While aspirin can be anti-inflammatory, the problem of bleeding can complicate dental therapies. Diabetic kidney disease also can lead to renal failure, which impairs oral health. What is not frequently recognized is that persons with diabetes often have coexistent depression, especially in the older years, and this can lead to a neglect of oral health. So all of these are interconnected areas. Therefore, the health system has to provide a composite response. It has to provide health education to communities and patients. It has to strengthen primary health care for early detection and care and minimize the missed opportunities in primary health care settings. We need to have capacity building of healthcare providers of all categories, and we must adopt a primary prevention approach to reduce risk factors. And therefore, all of this requires a strong composite approach which addresses common risk factors, but also early therapy at the point of care. Now, there are, of course, several challenges in the low and middle income countries. Poverty is an important factor. Poor health literacy, poor nutrition literacy, all of these are important knowledge barriers. Poor nutrition also has an affordability barrier because of the high price of many of the foods which are nourishing. Diabetes, too, in these settings is now increasingly recognized to be linked to poverty and malnutrition. Malnutrition has been referred to in the previous presentation. Now we know from David Barker's hypothesis, which is now very well evidenced, that fetal and early childhood malnutrition can set the stage for early onset of cardiovascular disease and diabetes in adulthood. We also know that in India, for example, that 1/3 of the persons with diabetes are actually thin diabetes. And in population-based studies, we are now seeing a fairly high prevalence of diabetes even in slums and low-income communities. So where, again, oral health is likely to be poor. So this kind of coexistent problems are very clearly also linked to poverty. At the same time, the tobacco epidemic, while we are achieving some control, is still unabated, and the tobacco companies are particularly targeting the low and middle income country populations. Rural populations have poor access to health services, and even where public health systems are the principal source of care, dental health professionals are not well positioned in those public health care systems. So all of these are challenges to our response. But we do need to provide a response at multiple levels. At the level of policy, we need to advance tobacco control through a variety of measures. Of course, taxation, ban on advertising, ban on smoking in public places, but certainly curb all manner of marketing and promotion. Sugar consumption should be discouraged, and I'm happy to see the UK having actually introduced the sugar taxes following the Mexico example. But again, we need to look at a whole array of measures to reduce sugar consumption, particularly in the face of very aggressive marketing by the industry. In 2003, I was a member of a WHO panel on nutrition, diet, nutrition, and prevention and control of non-communicable diseases, what is called the Technical Report 916 of WHO, which very clearly said a capping of sugar intake must be recommended. And lo and behold, there was a furor from the industry. But two very unlikely allies joined forces to protest before the Director General of WHO. And this was the George W. Bush era, mind you, not the Obama era. So the two unlikely allies who together went to protest before the Director General of WHO, Dr. Brundtland, were the United States of America and Cuba. Strange bedfellows. But nevertheless, that is how the sugar industry can unite people. Now, fruit and vegetables, of course, need to be promoted. And in terms of communities, health literacy needs to be promoted through mass media, and we need settings-based health promotion in schools, work sites, and community groups. We need, in the health system response, an emphasis on primary health services and technology-enabled point-of-care diagnostics, which even non-physician health professionals can practice, including dental health professionals, need not be essentially available if we can have dental hygienists, for example. Early care by community health worker, nurse practitioner, and family health teams. This is important, particularly in primary health care settings. And we know that in Brazil, the family health care team does consist of a dentist or a dental hygienist. And these cover all municipalities now, more than 96%. And this is a very important element that other low and middle income countries must register. Access to essential drugs is critical. Efficient referral services are also important. But one of the elements of the Sustainable Development Goals, we have heard a reference to non-communicable diseases as well as to reducing hunger and malnutrition. But one of the very important targets of SDG 3, target 3.8, is universal health coverage, which provides the health system platform. So where is oral health and universal health coverage as it evolves in various countries? Does it have a place or is it excluded? This is a question that needs to be asked, and its inclusion must be ensured. Now, coming briefly to one element of intersectoral policy response rather than just a health system response, and particularly since this is a nutrition collaborating center, the food environment depends upon diversity, adequacy, and safety, but it's determined by food transformation and consumer demand, market and trade systems, consumer purchasing power, and agricultural production. All of these have an impact upon the food environment. Unless we start addressing these, then the pathway to good nutrition for preventing diabetes or promoting oral health will remain blocked. And this is one of the roadblocks, affordability. Fruit and vegetable consumption per day in many of the low-income countries is much less than the WHO recommended 400 or 500 grams per day. For example, if you look at India, it's still in the range of about 130 grams per day. So these are the kind of problems that we ought to be looking at in terms of production, reduction of post-harvest losses, of processing issues, of pricing, and all of these become very integral when we look at a multisectoral response to the problems of diabetes and oral health, or NCDs overall. But the food industry also needs to have its behavior modified. And this is going to happen through regulation, food labeling, advertising restrictions, mandated restrictions on trans fat, sugar, and salt, voluntary or negotiated agreements to move towards healthier products in preference to unhealthy products, reduction in portion sizes, all of these are going to become important elements. Some of the recent pronouncements by the sections of the food and beverage industry, particularly the sugar sweetened beverage industry, appear to be articulating a desire to change or conveying a promise to change. But is that promissory note encashable? We do not know. Is it a proactive attempt to prevent, to really promote health, to become partners in health? Or is it preemptive to prevent strong regulatory measures and litigation, like in the case of tobacco industry, whether they're going to be litigated against because of the rising obesity, particularly childhood obesity? So we'll have to gauge what the motives and the behavior patterns of the food industry are. But of course, the food industry says that the consumer also must appreciate the products that we prepare. So they need to bridge both the credibility gap as well as the edibility gap. So we are looking at production diversity leading to dietary diversity. But a whole variety of supply chain dynamics, including food processing, intervene. And of course, consumer behavior becomes pretty important as well. In this context, quite often the alibi taken by the industry, which says government should not act like nanny states. They have no business to regulate. It is the consumer's choice. It's an intelligent, informed, independent choice by the consumer. But choice can be conscious, conditioned, or compelled. It may be a conscious choice made on correct information or wrong information. It can be conditioned by aggressive marketing and promotion, or by cultural factors, including peer pressure, or compelled most often, or constrained by availability and affordability factors, like we have shown in the case of fruit and vegetables availability, or pricing of healthy edible oils for that matter. So we cannot make it a choice of an individual and leave that entirely in the hands of that individual's choice, which is conditioned by so many factors. Therefore, we need to mold the markets. Quite often now, the market is treated as an autonomous entity, impervious, insensitive, unmindful of public health concerns. It cannot be so. It has to be sensitized and aligned to public health concerns, and this will happen only through a national policy framework which provides political, economic, and social motivators, incentives to promote healthier products, disincentives to discourage unhealthy products. So regulation can be both a carrot and a stick. As I say, a frozen carrot, which can be both a carrot and a stick. So we also need consumer consciousness, where health professionals, civil society, and the media must join hands. And we must alter industry practices by pointing out the importance of the health dividend and encouraging public-private partnerships in the right sense. But of course, this must be steered where possible by global covenants, particularly trade agreements, as well as agreements, for example, like the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. So there is an action almanac that we all together in the public health community, in the clinical medicine community, or in the health community as we call ourselves, must actually adopt. Of course, advanced science, like the Collaborating Center does, assemble an array of influencers, both in the academia as well as in the public space, including a number of other civil society organizations which have similar interests or overlapping interests, adopt an agreed agenda, align the actors for action, amplify advocacy together, and accelerate action, and assert accountability of governments, industry, and others. And this year, 2018, does offer us some very important opportunities. Firstly, in September in New York, there's a high-level meeting of heads of state, or similar high-level representatives of governments meeting to review the progress on NCDs. If you remember, in 2011, the United Nations had a high-level meeting which adopted a political resolution calling for a 25% reduction in premature NCD mortality by 2025. That, of course, got converted to a one-third reduction in NCD mortality, premature NCD mortality, between 2015 and 2030 in the SDGs. But nevertheless, keeping the 2025 calendar in mind, this review is going to take midway between 2011 and 2025 for a review. And this is an opportunity for oral health also to make its presence felt, to argue that it must now become a part of the expanded NCD agenda. At the same time, in October, in Astana, the new capital of Kazakhstan, there's going to be a 40-year celebratory event after the adoption of the Alma-Ata Declaration on Comprehensive Primary Health Care, or Health for All, in 1978 in Alma-Ata. This particular meeting will review the call for comprehensive primary health care and is steered by WHO and UNICEF. Again, oral health has to become a very important part of all primary health care settings. It is very important that those interested in promoting oral health be quite visible and effective in these places, what we can call the politics of presence. If you're not there, you will be missed and you will not be remembered. So you have to join there, but join not as a siloed advocacy effort, but join hands with others in the NCD space, others in the primary healthcare advocacy forum, also in those looking at broader public health considerations. So it is very important that oral health becomes much more visible and does not become an inconvenient truth that's forgotten. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Professor Reddy, for that tremendous overview of the relationship between NCDs and oral health and dental diseases. In fact, one of the remarkable things I thought is that one of the most comprehensive and very clear illustrations of periodontal disease, dental caries, and the NCDs. So thank you very much for that. We also would like to invite one or two questions now before the panel discussion. If there's any questions just now. David.
Professor Reddy, thank you very much indeed for that outstanding presentation. It's much appreciated. Can I just pick up on your final comment? And it, in a sense, goes to one of Newell Johnson's cries earlier on this afternoon. I think it is absolutely essential that the oral health community joins with the NCD community more widely. The World Dental Federation, FDI, has already done that, and there was a joint statement between both the NCD Alliance and FDI on actions against NCDs. And I think it would be really excellent if the IADR as well joined as partners in that whole process. I think it's absolutely essential that the research community is also in there, as well as that the community that represents dental practice.
I think given the Director General of WHO's particular emphasis on universal health coverage, we must look for entry points: universal health coverage, primary health care, NCDs. These are the three major doors that can open up the discussion. Also, we must keep reminding them, whether at the United Nations or at WHO, that even as we pursue the specific targets, the broad byline for the health goal, SDG 3, is health for all at all ages and well-being for all. You cannot have well-being throughout the life course without oral health. That is something that they must be reminded of.
Chris?
Yeah, just to echo your last slide, which is wonderful to end on, and Professor Williams's comment. Thank you, Professor Reddy, for a very nice overview on how oral health should be fitting into NCDs. And I'm the executive director of the International Association for Dental Research, for those of you who don't know me. And we have been participating in the high-level meeting of NCDs with our colleagues at the FDI, World Dental Federation, and other oral health organizations like the Academy for Dentistry International. I think David Alexander is here. We did attend a civil society hearing on July 5th at the United Nations. We were unsuccessful in getting our oral health voice heard at that session because there was a room of 400 people and limited time for questions, despite the fact that it was called a hearing. It was more listening and being talked to. But there was an opportunity after to submit comments, and we submitted joint comments between the IADR and the FDI about the inclusion of oral health really throughout that document. And then the draft Astana document, which is out right now, and I think comments were due last Friday, we submitted comments there. And that is particularly concerning because within that Astana document, there is a list of primary health care workers, which includes physicians, nurses, midwives, et cetera, of course, no dentists. So we drew that to their attention. You know, unfortunately, by the time these meetings actually happen, the opportunity for input is over, and we need more people, as you said, not only as oral health as a silo, but in partnership with other organizations, raising the importance of oral health so that in the drafting of these documents, we get oral health in there, included as part of other NCDs. So thank you very much for
May I suggest a strategic move?
Please.
While governments have actually also negotiated the Astana Declaration, and of course, ultimately it's going to be a negotiated instrument of the various governments. But leading up to Astana, and even at Astana, there's going to be some discussion on the declaration. And it is possible that if you send a policy brief to the different governments through their missions, something may come through for the simple reason that everybody wants to look at something new to say, something which others have not said before. So you might be able to stimulate some governments to say, okay, this is missing.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Very sage advice. Thank you.
Just to reiterate that point, that very point, if you recall in 2011, when the first high-level meeting occurred on NCDs, there was a side event organized by the president of Tanzania to put teeth into the NCDs, literally. And in Article 19 of that declaration, oral health is included. The trouble is, in between and in the implementation, it gets forgotten. And even the fine work that Paula and WHO did with regard to the statement about sugars predicated on caries and obesity, the discussion forgets about caries and focuses on diabetes and obesity. So it's a constant. But your point about reaching the governments, it was the president of Tanzania who led a movement of the least developed countries, 52, that led then to the adoption by 193 countries to insert oral health into that declaration. So I think the step often that we miss is the one that you reminded us about, is to approach our own governments.
I will even put a title to what you can say. What is more universal than oral health? Everybody doesn't get diabetes, everybody doesn't get cardiovascular disease, everybody doesn't get cancer, and everybody doesn't have an obstetric issue, but everybody requires oral health.
Yeah. Sir, you are remarkable because a person of your status to be so engaged in oral health is something we rarely find. And so I welcome that and I thank you. One of the difficulties we historically have is to get published in wider journals than the dental press. As I said at the beginning of this afternoon, we're preaching to the converted in this room. But watch The Lancet over the next couple of months because there are some breakthroughs coming in communication.
Thank you so much. I think we should move to the last of our presentations. And before that, I'm going to ask Professor Mark Tomlinson to hand over a Newcastle University birthday present to Professor Reddy. And those who are wanting to ask questions, there will be further opportunities in the panel discussion at the end. So I'm going to ask Mark to now introduce Professor Jim Mann.
Thank you. Before I do that, I've always said that you should never start off speaking to the public in any public environment with an apology. I'm clearly going to have to apologise for putting your first slide on. But my first apology, however, is although we have had a fantastic afternoon this afternoon, and the technology has worked wonderfully in that we're having this here and we're also having it in Newcastle, I did assure Jim that it would be fine doing this with a Mac presentation. However, we can have a fine Mac presentation here, or we can have a fine Mac presentation in Newcastle, or we can have a slightly compromised Mac presentation at both sites. Now, Jim has very kindly offered to take that latter option, and for that, I take the responsibility for that. I apologise to Jim for that, but I'm sure we will bear with him when one or two of the slides are perhaps not at the level that he might accept. Can I just then formally introduce Professor Jim Mann, who is Professor of Human Nutrition and Medicine at the University of Otago, and consultant physician in endocrinology at Dunedin Hospital, and has been for the last 25 years. Previously lecturing at Oxford University and a consultant at the Radcliffe Infirmary in Oxford. He's also been director of the Edgar Diabetes and Obesity Research Centre, the WHO Collaborating Centre for Human Nutrition, and principal investigator for the Reddit Institute, a National Institute for Research Excellence at Massey University. His research has principally been in the field of lipid and carbohydrates as they relate to coronary heart disease and diabetes, and in the field of obesity. He has a particular interest in the role of obesity as a cause of cancer, and was a member of the advisory group and panel of the World Cancer Research Fund, and was author of the policy report, Policy and Action for Cancer Prevention. He has authored more than 300 peer-reviewed papers, and edited and authored several textbooks, including The Essentials of Human Nutrition, published by Oxford University Press. I give you Professor Mann.
So we'll start off with going backwards to my first slide. Thank you very much, and yes, thank you for making the apology on my behalf. This is the first time for years that Max hasn't worked in this particular context, so accept my apologies too. A couple of things before I start. Firstly, I think it's very important if one refers to sugars that one makes a disclaimer, and that is to say I have no conflicts. Those are all the groups with which I have an involvement, but none have a particular interest in sugar, and I haven't received any money from the sugar industry, I am pleased to report. Next thing to say, Paula, happy birthday. From a junior colleague. We are not quite as old as you are. We haven't quite reached the age of 21, but we're very close behind. So happy birthday and many more successful years to come. The last thing I want to say just before I start is to also, as others have done, acknowledge Andrew Rugg-Gunn. When I first started working in this area, he was already a monumental name that I respected. We served together on the Coma Sugars panel, which reported in 1989. And may I say that if Britain and the world had taken the advice of the Coma Sugars panel, we would be much further on the way to UN sustainable goals. And pity that our advice wasn't taken then. But what I'm proposing to do today is really to take you through the story of free sugars and obesity, which is my title, but also to refer to cardiometabolic disease, because this day and age one cannot talk about obesity without talking about cardiometabolic disease. They are very, very closely linked. And the way I shall do this is really to talk historically, because I think it makes quite an interesting story to start with this as it was in the second half of the last century. Makes me feel incredibly old to be thinking I'm talking about the second half of the last century, but there was a lot happened in the second half of the last century. The next phase was the first 10 years of this century, or perhaps the first 15 years of this century, and we thought that everything was going to be resolved, but we just end up in the last year or two with a bit of return to chaos. And so you may as well hear the whole picture, which I shall try to summarize in the next half an hour, or hopefully a bit less. I don't need to talk about the definition of sugars because Paula has done that already, but I just want to point out that there is confusion when you have these different definitions, because people say, what is the difference between added sugar and free sugars? And they're more or less the same, but not quite. And when one comes to implementation, it causes a certain amount of confusion, but there may or may not be time to talk about that. But I do need to very briefly define cardiometabolic disease. I'm sure everybody in this room probably does know what I mean by cardiometabolic disease, but just to make absolutely sure, I shall spend 1.5 minutes on this. And that is that it's a group of conditions really with the clinical manifestations of coronary heart disease and other cardiovascular diseases, but very much is now inclusive of obesity, type 2 diabetes that goes with obesity very often, prediabetes, and this phenomenon which is now called the metabolic syndrome and has had various other names over the years, which is characterized by a whole range of metabolic and clinical derangements which no doubt contribute to the cardiovascular disease. And I think it's a very interesting aspect to point out that although the world rejoices in coronary heart disease having come down in Britain and many other comparable countries, there is a grave risk now that with this phenomenon of obesity and the metabolic syndrome contributing to coronary heart disease, that if we don't do something about this problem, this wonderful reduction we've had in coronary heart disease may well start to be reversed, and indeed there are some suggestions in some populations worldwide that this may already be happening. Well, here we go with a history lesson, and I know that there are some people in this room who will remember John Yudkin, and now is not the time to really talk too much about whether John Yudkin was a visionary, somebody that foresaw the future, or a crook, because people have called him both. But John Yudkin, with Pure, White and Deadly in the 1960s, talked about sugar as a cause of cardiovascular disease, diabetes, dyslipidemia, and obesity. But the 1960s and the 1970s, and I particularly talk with feeling about the 1970s because that's when my interest started in this area, were times of huge confusion about sugar. There were John Yudkin's and others' epidemiological studies published in as distinguished journals as The Lancet, which were totally flawed. And now is not the time to critique those studies, but they were totally flawed. The dietary intervention studies, which came from Queen Elizabeth College in this town, were interesting, but very difficult to interpret because all these dietary intervention studies used massive amounts of sugar, which really had little bearing on even the largest sugar eaters that existed anywhere. So it was really a bit of a problem when I first came on into this area and published my first paper in the 1970s on this, because we actually showed that when you took free-living individuals and you asked them to restrict their sugar but increase the intake of any other carbohydrates that they possibly wished to have, they just couldn't do it. They lost weight and they changed their triglyceride levels, they came down. So interesting that that was the 1970s, and we actually went on to show, forgive me for talking about my own data here, but it's easier to find one's own data when you look back at these historical things, and when you try to look at the other people that came up with the same things, their data seems to have disappeared. But anyway, believe me, there were others who showed the same thing. And we then showed that actually sucrose or sugar restriction, when there was no weight loss, really didn't have much effect on triglyceride levels unless you gave those massive amounts of sugar which the Yudkin group gave earlier on. And also dietary fat had to be saturated. There were a very small number of people who seemed to be sucrose sensitive and whose triglycerides went up, but they were a very, very small number. This is a sort of cathartic experience for me because, I mean, I think we were responsible for some of the chaos that arose. We also did studies in diabetes, and we actually showed that when you gave people with diabetes some sugar, in place of other complex carbohydrate, a term which we shouldn't use, but starchy carbohydrate, that actually, if the sugar was given in moderation, it didn't actually make a great deal of difference. You can see blood glucose profiles there, and the insulin profiles really didn't change. So we sort of came to the conclusion that maybe, you know, a moderate amount of sugar wasn't that bad. And it led me to a debate with John Yudkin, as I was talking about earlier on today, on BBC One television at prime time, a debate about whether sugar was or was not bad for you. And I was actually the person that said, well, you know, it seems that a moderate amount of sugar isn't that bad, really. And John Yudkin turned around to me and he said, my boy, when you grow up and you're a bit wiser, you'll know better. It was a bit bad when that happens on television. Especially primetime television, when every single person I knew in Britain saw the jolly programme. But I hope I'm a little bit wiser now, and the story will continue as it evolved. But there was a tendency then, not just from me, but from those people working in this field, to somewhat exonerate sugar from where John Yudkin had put it, thanks to Pure White and Deadly. And of course, this was the era when everybody knew that saturated fat was bad. And personally, I still think that saturated fat is not great stuff and should be reduced as much as possible. So the emphasis was on reduction of saturated fat, whether it came from greasy hamburgers or cheese, or heaven forbid, the two combined. And that was the nutritional message at the time. So hardly surprisingly that the food industry were a bit confused and thought, what on earth could they do? And so they started to produce these wonderful products, 97% fat-free apricot slices. Now, that was a delicious apricot slice. I actually ate it after I had took the photograph. It was an Australian brand. But that particular bar, if you look at the panel on the side, you'll see that it had about 30 grams of sugars. And not surprisingly, those, I think there were about 2 raisins in there, but the rest of it were free sugars. So you can see what was happening. And saturated fat, sure, we'll get rid of it, said the food industry, but we've got to put something nice in there. And it was at that time that the FAO, principally, with support from WHO, said, well, we think we better try and put this whole carbohydrate thing in perspective, and not just the sugars area, but the whole carbohydrate thing in perspective. And they put together a meeting in Rome as one of their so-called expert consultations, which I was privileged to be a part of. And we met at a wonderful venue and ate wonderful food and came up with a report which none of us actually saw until it was in the format that you see here on the left-hand side of the slide. And you will read on the right-hand panel the bottom line there, which says excessive intakes of sugar, which compromise micronutrient density, should be avoided. Well, that's pretty obvious. There is no evidence of a direct involvement of sucrose, other sugars and starch in the etiology of lifestyle-related diseases. Well, several people on that committee, including myself, fortunately I was a bit younger then, were apoplectic. We had never said that. And the truth prevailed, I don't know if any of you remember this, the truth prevailed in a panorama program which took years of investigation, supported by a number of us, and which really showed what had happened. And basically, the process was subverted. I think that program is still available, and it really makes very interesting watching, and I'm rather more proud of my performance on that particular program than on BBC One version a few years earlier in debating with John Yudkin. But basically the process was entirely subverted. I can tell you more about that afterwards. Now, this is one of the slides that got subverted by somebody, but didn't work. There was actually not a lot of new research going on at that time in relation to the kind of metabolic effects and the obesity effects of sugar. There was a substantial amount of work going on by Andrew and by others that had been done in relation to dental disease. This study, the Carmen study, was quite an interesting one, which was actually summarized, is summarized in the Mac version on the left-hand side, which you can't see. But basically, it was an attempt to look at people who were overweight and obesity, who were overweight or obese, and had the metabolic syndrome. And the idea was to look at what happened to the various metabolic profiles as well as body fatness if you put people onto a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet, but altered the nature of carbohydrate. And basically what it showed in this particular paper was that if you put somebody onto a low-fat, high-complex carbohydrate diet, on the whole they did pretty well. If you put them onto a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet that was high in sugars, they didn't do so well. Surprise, surprise. But actually, this was really one of the sort of first of its kind of new and better studies. This was again, one of the few studies that were available when we were involved in the WHO technical report, which Srinath mentioned, and which Srinath, Paula, and I were all involved. And this was the report which came up with a magical 10% of free sugars maximum. And I do just want to comment here that in fact we relied very much on the dental caries data to actually come up with this figure. Those of us who represented the obesity and metabolic field could really not provide a lot of data at that particular time. It was dental caries that did it. And you've heard from Srinath the problems that we ran into with the sugar industry, particularly from the United States, and as Srinath said, also Cuba, trying to kill the report that came from TR 916. But it sort of survived, not least of all because of the hard work done by Dr. Brundtland as Director General at the time. So, not a lot. So we've moved on from TR 916, and not a lot was happening at around that time, as I've mentioned. But people did become, particularly in the United States, very concerned about the increase in free sugars, particularly in the United States, coming from fructose and high fructose corn syrup. And George Bray, the very distinguished American obesity expert, showed how the increase in obesity, though not the increase in overweight, interestingly, and there's quite a lot of evidence along these lines, the increase in obesity particularly seemed to parallel the increase that was taking place in the United States in these particular free sugars. So it was roundabout at this time that the WHO NUGAG, which Paula has spoken about in relation to dental disease, was asked to reconsider this question of sugar, because there was a lot of niggling, and it wasn't just from from the United States and Cuba, but there was niggling from a number of other countries, particularly, I might say, Italy, that this was not a satisfactory recommendation, so please look again. And we had a lot of discussion around this and came to the conclusion that the only place we were likely to get some new information was around dental health and around obesity. So these were the questions you saw earlier on, the questions that were asked in relation to dental health, but these were the questions that were asked in relation to obesity. And goodness knows what that little thing is there. I can assure you I didn't put it there. But we were asked, my colleague Lisa Timerenga and I were asked to produce a series of systematic reviews and meta-analyses, rather like the ones that you heard about this afternoon earlier, rather before the tea break from Paula, to look at the question of sugar and obesity. And what we demonstrated, and I'll just take you through this very quickly, and you can see some quite interesting numbers, that when you looked at studies where there was a tendency to reduce the usual sugar intake compared with the usual sugar intake, there was a tendency for a greater weight in the usual or high sugar groups by just under 1 kilogram. When you looked at it the other way round, which was to increase sugar versus other carbohydrate, there was again about 0.8 kilograms, just under, well, 3/4 of a kilogram, greater weight with increased sugars. But the interesting thing is there were a couple of studies, most of the studies were incredibly short term, that when you looked at the longer term studies, we weren't then talking about such a very small change. We were talking that in studies that went on for longer than 8 weeks, there was something like a nearly 3 kilogram difference in body weight, which actually matched very well the studies we published in the 1970s, which actually went on for something like 6 months. But what was interesting and important in this saga that I'm describing was that when we looked at comparisons where there was an attempt to control energy intake, that is to say, change your sugar, reduce your sugar and have some starch or vice versa, under strictly controlled energy conditions, there wasn't this same effect. In fact, the body weight was virtually identical. To complete the picture, and there were a whole lot more I could show you, there were cohort studies, and this is just looking at the cohort studies in children, which again suggested that when you looked at higher versus lower sugar consumers, the higher sugar consumers were somewhat more overweight. So this time round, we felt we could contribute, unlike with TR916, along with the data that were produced by Paula and her colleagues, we could contribute to this recommendation, which you've seen a couple of times today. It was moderately controversial, but on the whole has survived without anybody really being able to pull it to pieces, as they did with the earlier recommendations. Well, things start to hot up quite excitedly now. Nature chose to publish this paper, which you may have seen, many of you will have seen, describing the toxic truth about sugar. And this man, Lustig, has accused me repeatedly on occasion of not being sufficiently supportive when he describes sugar as being a toxic substance. You can decide whether you think it is a toxic substance or not. I think it's a slightly toxic substance, perhaps, but that's for the conclusion. And what Lustig suggested was that chronic exposure to fructose, in particular, produced results that were not unlike some of the exposures to ethanol, long-term exposures to alcohol, inasmuch as it caused hypertension, increases in uric acid, myocardial infarction through the dyslipidemia insulin resistance, dyslipidemia through de novo lipogenesis, pancreatitis through hypertriglyceridemia. I think that's a bit far-fetched, but the others certainly are not unreasonable. Obesity and malnutrition through obesity, and then liver dysfunction with this very scary condition associated with obesity, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. And if not addiction, at least habituation. And the critical thing that Lustig said was this can happen quite regardless of whether there is a calorie deficit. It is something which is a specific effect of sugar, and fructose in particular. So this is what we had to try and sort out. So we attempted some more of these famous meta-analyses, which keep some of us in business, and I think do make a contribution, a very important contribution, that need to be looked at in the context of other research. And what you can see here is, interestingly, that whether one looked at isocaloric studies or whether you looked at studies where people were allowed to have ad libitum energy intakes, there was a small but highly significant effect of sugar on triglycerides that we had to conclude was clearly independent of body weight. This was a level of sophistication that we hadn't been able to adopt previously. There was a suggestion of an effect on cholesterol, though not statistically significant when you looked at the ad libitum studies, but certainly significant overall, and a suggestion from the longer-term studies that there was even an effect on blood pressure. So we're starting to look as if the story for sugar is getting even more powerful. And I think of particular interest is this phenomenon, which is highly relevant to dental disease as well, the fact that consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages seems unequivocally to be associated with both obesity and diabetes, particularly obesity in children. And interestingly and excitingly, from this paper in the BMJ, this is the BMJ Open actually, I should have said this isn't the actual, the ordinary BMJ, that even when one controls for energy intake, there is a suggestion of an increased risk in this particular one, diabetes. So fascinating stuff. There had been slightly before that a paper from the N. Haynes study in the United States. People followed prospectively, suggesting that this is added sugars this time, that people with a high intake of added sugars also had an increased risk of coronary heart disease. This was not clearly able to be looked at in terms of whether this was independent of obesity or not, but nevertheless here an important relationship. Now, for those of you that don't like too much epidemiology but want to see some real hard science to back this stuff up, there is hard science and strong experimental data which do back this up. A whole range of metabolic factors which do seem to be related particularly to the fructose component of sucrose. And there isn't time, and I've only got about 5 minutes left, which in fact is precisely what I need, I hope, to just show you a couple of the kind of experimental studies that have been done, and there have been a lot of experimental studies done. This is comparing beverages sweetened with fructose compared with beverages sweetened with glucose, specifically on a range of metabolic findings. And here you can see that in the two top left-hand panels, what happens to glucose tolerance in the top panel, what happens to insulin levels in the second panel with the use of glucose-containing beverages. But when the beverages contain fructose, they're sweetened with fructose, you can see there's a deterioration in glucose tolerance, there's a deterioration, or rather an increase in insulin levels, and in this measure of insulin resistance, shown in the bottom panel, no change in the glucose beverage, but in the fructose beverage, a reduction of insulin sensitivity, in other words, increased insulin resistance. And I'm not going to go through this one in great detail, but a whole series of changes with regard to lipid metabolism as well on fructose compared with glucose. If you are concerned about ectopic fat accumulation, particularly in the liver, this study, which compared regular cola in the United States with milk, diet cola, and water, showed the potential of the regular cola sweetened with sugars, particularly containing fructose, showing that there was ectopic fat accumulation in a number of places, including muscle, but particularly important in the liver. So it does seem as if there is some toxic truth about sugar, and it should be that the story is closed. I mean, how much more data do we need to actually implement what we said in COMA that should be done, what we said in TR916, and what we said in NUGAG and the WHO recommendations? But the story doesn't ever seem to be going away anytime soon. And despite the fact that the authors of this paper seem to be very reputable and claim no conflict of interest whatsoever with the industry, they wrote a paper called Fructose Replacement of Glucose or Sucrose in Food or Beverages Lowers Postprandial Glucose and Insulin Without Raising Triglycerides. What more declarative title could you have than that? If I was the referee of this paper, I wouldn't have even read it. I would have recommended it be thrown out. No, that's not true. Of course I would have read it, I hope. But it is an extraordinary paper. There are 2 or 3 other papers like it from the same group. There is an editorial in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And what they conclude, and I'll just show you one of the sort of slides, they suggest that in type 1 diabetes and impaired glucose tolerance and type 2 diabetes, that actually if you replace glucose with fructose, you actually get a slightly better outcome. Well, this is looking pretty good, isn't it, for the sugar industry? And if you really want to read some interesting papers, please go home tonight and read these papers and the editorials based on it. You should be able to identify in about 10 minutes what the flaws are in these papers. Basically, they were feeding people an enormous amount of fructose, and if anybody has tried having 80 grams of fructose a day, you'll know probably where you'll spend a certain amount of time during the next 24 hours, and it won't be sitting at a meeting, because you'll have to excuse yourself. The people actually lost a couple of kilograms in weight, or maybe it was even a kilogram in weight, and the conclusion was the weight loss was minimal and couldn't possibly have explained these particular findings. Well, anybody who has worked in this area for any length of time will know that even a very modest amount of weight loss, which was, I presume, caused by the diarrhea associated with the high doses of fructose, could produce these results. But I end really with the conclusion that I think we can say 3 things. And there is no doubt in my mind that the totality of evidence provides a very strong justification for the appreciable reduction of free sugars, and that this will reduce obesity and cardiometabolic disease, which is what I've been talking about, as well as the dental health issues. This debate, which has been going on forever about whether the effect is mediated by promoting obesity or whether it's a direct approach, is, I think, a fascinating one for those of us who do research, but actually is not helpful to the public health message. Because basically, if you reduce your sugar intake, you will reduce obesity, you will reduce these metabolic abnormalities, as well as improve dental health. And I personally interpret the data that we now have as distinct from my own views about 20 years ago, was that there is almost certainly some direct effect of sugar as well as the effect on energy balance. But this doesn't need to confuse the public health message. Whether fructose is bad or not, I think will emerge in the not too distant future. But if we simply go with those recommendations to limit free sugars, we'll get the desired result. So I really just leave you with a thought: is sugar the new tobacco, which some people have suggested? I think probably not quite, but there is no doubt that it's going to make a major contribution to health. And that I just can't help wondering how much the food industry remains involved in creating these little elements of doubt which keep on coming through, as I have implied. I hope I'm wrong. And finally, to end with, just a reminder that if we are going to recommend a substantial reduction of free sugars, we really need to remember that actually it involves about 50 grams a day, doesn't it? If we talk about the, pardon, 40? For an adult, yes, about 50 grams a day if one's on a 2,000 calorie diet. And it's pretty easy to get 10% of sugar or 50 grams a day on the kind of diet we eat now. There's a bowl of cereal, which could have 13 grams, some juice, 25 grams, a very healthy looking muesli bar with 6, and just 1 teaspoon of jam is going to create that 50 grams of sugar. So I think the grounds for making the recommendation are profoundly strong, but we have to remember when implementing it, in the light of the current sort of diet that we're eating in Britain and most of the countries represented here today, it's not going to be easy. Thank you.
Since we're setting up the panel discussion, could I just invite yourself and the other speakers to come up to the podium. But before we do that, we're going to hand a small birthday present. And thank you very much for your tremendous contribution. Thanks. Okay, so could we call upon Professor Mann and along with Professor Reddy, Dr. Varenne and Professor Moynihan to join the panel. And I know there were some questions earlier that because of time constraints we were unable to take all of those, so I'm very happy to take those now. David Alexander. David, I know you had a hand up earlier, so this gives us the opportunity.
I really wanted to ask the panel on something that Professor Reddy sparked in several of us, which was about holding hands with the other professions and the term universal health coverage. You know, we say this, we go around in cycles. Every few years we need to work closer together. And my question is dentistry and those in oral health, are we destined to always miss the boat and never grasp the hands of those others? For years, we've taken the dental school away from the medical school. In some universities in North America, they're not even on the same campus. They're 50 miles apart. We have different payment systems. Dentistry and oral health is not reimbursed in many countries in the same system as general health care. So are we just wired so separately that we will never become part of that hand-holding group and we'll never get to the major misunderstood term of universal health coverage, which is about reasonable access to care that will make a meaningful change in people's lives? So that's really my question, that can we make this leap of holding hands that you say we need to?
Thanks, David. Does anyone want to take that as an issue? Yeah.
Could I just respond to that briefly as somebody who represents another clinical specialty? I am an endocrinologist and with a particular interest in diabetes. And I should say, and I'd be interested to hear what Srinath has to say, although he's a cardiologist, but they're superior to endocrinologists. For a long time, there's been almost no interest in dental health amongst my clinical colleagues. But there has been a huge awakening of interest. And indeed, now if you go to diabetes meetings, you'll actually find papers that relate to dental health. And I think that even though we might not be a very influential clinical specialty, there will be a very strong support for joining forces with, between dentistry and endocrinology. So I would hope that there's at least one clinical specialty that would be keen to join forces.
It is important that efforts are made to connect at various levels. But when one reaches out to professional organizations who are highly focused on a particular specialty, they are much more likely to be protective of the interests of their own group. Particularly when it comes to universal health coverage, when you are asking for different sets of tests and treatments to be included in the package that is usually part of the universal health coverage. So in that battle, they are unlikely to be welcoming of other groups, and they will fight off. even if not openly, they will exercise their influence for their own sake. It is important to connect, at least to converse, if not to convert. But I think where you will get the maximum purchase as you move into the broader stream, when you're looking at primary health care, family physicians, civil society organizations who are interested in health as a right, those are some of the areas where actually you will get much greater acceptance. And using the momentum of that, you can influence the actors who are also in fairly siloed professional streams. So I think it's very important not only to look at the NCD Alliance, which is very important, no doubt, but to engage with other groups who have a much broader area of interest and who are likely to be much more understanding of the need to address all aspects of health.
Thank you very much, Srinath. Another comment from the panel on that one before we move to David?
Yeah. Yes, just I was thinking about David Barnes, some decades before, already wrote on this aspect, you know, and predicted that the future of dental medicine will be part of medicine because, you know, high-level technology and all this evolution in terms of technology and things. And I think it's one of the entry points to try to move this agenda because we know that dentists should be part of medical profession, and so I think we have to start maybe from, you know, primary healthcare level, primary healthcare approach, and think about which kind of health professional we need to respond to the need of population. And I think if we are not starting from the field, from the real need, and think about which kind of skills and knowledge and health workers we need to move, and I think maybe it's some countries with few dental schools today in Africa and other countries, I think could start, and I know that there are some initiatives, you know, pushing this aspect of auxiliaries and rather than having high-level dentists. And I think maybe through this way, coming from, again, the field, maybe we can move this agenda to ensure at the end we have real intervention, package of intervention, part of this universal health coverage. It's my view on that.
Thank you so much. Paula, did you want to comment? Or yeah, okay. David, you had a hand up.
Yeah, thank
David
you.
Williams.
Yes, thank you. I think to the point about dialogue between the oral health profession and other health professions, I think the dialogue, certainly in the area of diabetes and oral health, is developing. And I know there's to be a meeting next year between the World Heart Federation and the American Academy of Periodontology and the European Federation of Periodontology, which I think is a good step in the right direction, with the emphasis perhaps more on the associations between those diseases rather than getting caught up in what's been a long-standing debate around causation, with somehow the sense that oral health is causally implicated and perhaps in danger of overstating the importance of that rather than thinking about what's to be gained by looking at the association. So that's, if you like, an observation. But one of the questions that I have is, how do you think, to the panel, we could become more effective as the oral health community in engaging with civil society? Because as Professor Mann said, everybody has experience of oral disease, but we find it difficult to identify those sort of civil society advocacy groups who have that interest. I mean, in a way, if you have a disease that is less common but has perhaps a higher degree of mortality associated with it, then you get active groups. But we seem to have difficulty, I think, in identifying who those civil society groups are with whom we can interact. It would be really helpful to get the comments from the panel on that.
I have no answer to your question, but I know that it's something we have already discussed, and it's one of the weakness, I think, of the oral health area, having no real patient group, fighting and struggling to have better visibility of oral health and things like this. So it's the reason that maybe again, we have to work closely with NCD Alliance and other group of association, organization. They are already dealing with a group of disease, and maybe this kind of approach could be more successful. But again, it's a key aspect. Why we have no real civil society groups that are taking oral health issue? It's some important questions.
Do you mind if I make a comment on this as well? Because we had a discussion this morning, and in one of those sessions, we made the strong point in advocacy that it's not about health anymore. It's about health and well-being. And the new FDI definition, if I might say, was emphasizing that point very strongly, that oral health also has a significant psychosocial, psychological, and mental health component. And I think that's another way into this argument.
May I suggest that the oral health community engage with the People's Health Movement? It's a fairly radical movement, but nevertheless fairly effective in articulation of health as a human right, asking for a very broad-based approach to health, including universal health coverage. It is important to raise the issue of oral health as something that everybody needs in every country at every age, and that these services can be provided at relatively low cost and therefore can be accommodated in universal health coverage without busting the budget. And some of these arguments need to come through very clearly. And since the poor are likely to be the most deprived of good oral health services, equity becomes an important angle to approach this problem from, to make the argument from. I would reiterate, though I have been strongly associated with the NCD Alliance from the beginning, that it's very important to engage with them. But when it ultimately comes to actually exercising influence at the national level, rather than at the global level, the highly professional organizations linked to single diseases are more likely to bargain for their own space. In a pyramid, which represents from primary care to tertiary care, the space at the top is very narrow. You'll get elbowed out. The base is much wider. That's where you'll find the accommodating space. Then you can climb up. So you engage with everybody, but use your leverage most in primary care and universal health coverage.
Thank you very much. Lewis?
Lois and I are edged problem between us ladies first.
I just want to respond to the civil society question as a sociologist. I'm not a dentist. The experience in the United States, we faced this problem at one time with the National Institute of Dental Research before we changed our name to the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research. We needed some consumer advocacy, some public advocacy. We eventually found advocacy in certain groups of networks of specialized disease areas, Sjogren's, ectodermal dysplasia, Juvenile Diabetes Association. These are all civil society groups. There are a whole group of them where the patients, the kid doesn't have any teeth. We need implants. The dentures don't work, you know. It came from the patients. And when patients testify before the U.S. Congress, they make an impact where the professionals may not make that same kind of impact because they're taken for their self-interest. But the patients can articulate. So that was one source of how the Friends of the NIDCR, which is now resident in the American Association of Dental Research, that does have advocacy at that level. Now, I don't know whether at the global level, IADR also needs some kind of social advocacy arm to focus in on uncivil society question. I think is food for thought.
Did you want to make a point? Okay, that's on the same point, and then we'll move to another point. Yeah.
Well, just briefly on this point, because I have a question about sugar. But I started this debate this afternoon with my first question about how do we engage the public, and what Lois has said has been very helpful. What Professor Reddy said has been very helpful. And I often quote the HIV/AIDS story. Where are the marches on Washington? Where are the quilts? It was public movement that really moved the whole of society to improve funding, to improve recognition of the problem, to be humanitarian about it, and to fund the science. And we have to do that. We have to approach that bottom up in that way, but the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control tells you how effective top down can be. So we have to come at this really from both directions. I think things are beginning to happen in several parts of the world. So I will ask my factual question about the science, but you may want to hold it because I'd like to ask Jim Mann. I'm muddled about the benefits and disbenefits of sucrose, fructose, and glucose. And where is glucose in this mix? Because many of the high-energy so-called sports drinks are fortified with glucose, not with sucrose or fructose. So I have that scientific question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a terribly important point, and I'm glad you raised it, so thank you. I mean, there is absolutely no doubt that if one looks at the effect of on energy balance and weight and obesity, and everything stems from that too. I mean, if you increase obesity, you're going to increase all those metabolic derangements. That is an effect of total free sugars, and it doesn't matter which free sugars you look at. If you look at the very specific metabolic effects in relation to lipids, in relation to insulin and so on, it does look as if fructose may have some unique detrimental effects. But the point that I was wanting to make is that it's very important not to confuse the public health message, because if we say reduce total free sugars, as we have from all sorts of international and national bodies come to that recommendation, that will deal with fructose as well. You will get rid of quite a lot of the fructose in the diet. So does that summary...
what about fortified drinks with glucose?
Yeah. Well, fortified drinks from glucose are high in free sugars. There's glucose contributing as a free sugar and contributing to obesity. And there are a lot of people who think they need those fortified groups. I mean, never mind the athletes. I always tell the story about a couple of years ago, I had a patient, and I noticed in her handbag that she had one of these high energy drinks. And I said, she was a lady in her 70s who was overweight. And I said, what on earth are you doing with those drinks? And she said, you told me I had to increase my physical activity. I've got to have these drinks to go to the gym. They told me I had to have that. So that's the kind of thing we need to put a stop to. But those high energy drinks are contributing to energy excess and should be not used. Well, maybe athletes need them, but nobody else does.
They produce different Stefan curves.
Yes, yeah. But I mean, I think let's get the public health message across, which covers everything that we need to cover. And we can, in these meetings, we can have some debate about glucose and fructose, but it doesn't influence the public health message.
Okay.
Well, I was just going to say that the thing is, if you start a public health message about fructose, the danger is that people start to reduce fruit. But most fructose comes from soft drinks when it's combined with sucrose and not from fresh whole fruit. And so I agree with Jim that reducing free sugars is a clear public health message, and we all need to start delivering consistent messages. Yeah. Just with your previous comment about the top-down and bottom-up approach, I think both are important, and there's a very interesting story from the UK when Jamie Oliver brought out his Sugar Rush television programme. His headline was dental caries, it wasn't obesity, and because of that it really made people sit up, and it was that led to the sugar tax in the UK.
Well done. Fantastic. Is there one more question? Yes, because I know you've been waiting for a while, and I think that will be the end of...
No, but there's no time. That's okay?
No, there's someone behind you as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And then you can make the final comment. Yeah.
It's really back to the same subject that we've been discussing, Nigel Carter. I'm CEO of the Oral Health Foundation and also currently chair of the Platform for Better Oral Health in Europe. And it is very sad as an organisation based in the UK but trying to take on activity around the world that we're one of the very few third sector organisations that's actually devoted to promoting oral health. When I look around the world, it would be great to see a network of similar not-for-profits promoting oral health, and it really doesn't exist. But going back to the lobbying, the discussion that we're having is around the importance of oral health. And we all assume it's important, and people should realise it's important, so why aren't they doing it? Why aren't they integrating it into general health policies? Of course they should be doing. I think what we need to learn, and what we've learned from the Platform for Better Oral Health in Europe, which is aiming to lobby the European Commission and the European Parliament to improve oral health and raise oral health at the agenda, the things that policymakers and politicians are interested in are totally different to the ones that we're interested in. It's not about carriage rates, it's about money. It's about quality of life. It's about loss of working days in the economy from adults going for dental care, for adults having to have time off to take their children for dental care. It's the cost of doing mass extractions in secondary care. These are the things that motivate people. In terms of budgets, we're always going to be low priority. We have to learn how to increase the priority and the relevance by mainstreaming it.
Okay, that's a comment as opposed to a question, a very important comment. I think it's a very good one. If there's any response, then we'll be happy. Or do you want to have a final word to the audience?
I think in NCDs, for example, the debate actually turned when Harvard School of Public Health and the World Economic Forum produced a report on the economic cost of NCDs. That certainly had an impact. So making the economic argument, as you rightly pointed out, is very important. But I think there needs to be a pincer movement. One, making the appeal on the ground of the economic argument. The second, health as a right. So you're required to engage with the civil society on that forum. So it is that actually which will bring about a change.
Okay, now one final question or one final comment?
Yeah, it's a question actually. I'm a very convinced person on the role of sugars on caries, and I'm talking about caries specifically, not general oral health. And all my speech, my lectures, everything is about sugars. However, 2 weeks ago, I'm a part of the advisory board of ORCA. And in the inaugural lecture, the speaker was saying that in Scandinavian countries, they control caries by toothbrushing, not by sugar taxation or sugar restriction. And caries control, they said, it came because of people started to have more education, higher access to health, but not because they were promoting something related with sugars control. So I don't know what to say now after that, because they were pretty effective. If you see the numbers in caries, they are very low and they still keep consuming high amounts of sugars. So what do you think about that in terms of dental considerations? I'm not talking about cardiovascular diseases, I'm not talking about obesity or diabetes.
Well, I think you should be talking about cardiovascular disease and diabetes, because we need to stop thinking about the mouth in isolation. I think, yes, it is important to promote oral hygiene. Yes, it is important to expose to fluoride to minimise the risk of oral health. But we need to reduce sugars. Yes, it's the main cause of dental caries, and we should treat disease by getting rid of causes. But we shouldn't look at it in isolation. We shouldn't be giving out our advice on dental caries, just focusing on that alone. It has to be, when we talk about diet, we have one diet to prevent all diseases. And so therefore, through reducing sugars, we'll address obesity, dental caries, and other cardiometabolic diseases, as we've heard today.
I think that's a very appropriate comment with which to wrap the session up, and there'll just be one or two comments from the chairs just to thank everyone, but my comment is to say that congratulations to Paula, not only for being a wonderful colleague for 21 years to so many people and to me, but also to congratulate her on putting this program on, which I think has been tremendous. And we offered you a treat this afternoon and an appropriate curtain raiser to the IADR, and I think we got that. And for a final word, I'm going to hand over to my co-chair.
Thank you very much. I just would like to thank everybody who has been participating in this. So our panel, Paula has already been thanked, and thank you very much, Paula. I would like to thank our colleagues in Newcastle who are, I'm assuming, still getting this stream here. And then I would like to welcome everybody who's here in London to our reception through the other side of the building here. Unfortunately, although we would love to do that to our colleagues in Newcastle, it'll take them a little while to get here, I think. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your participation today. It's been a very active and a very positive day, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you very much indeed.